A Tiger's Skin by W. Jacobs. The travelling sign painter, who was repainting the sign of the cauliflower, was enjoying a well-earned respite from his labours. On the old table under the shade of the elms, mammoth sandwiches and a large slice of cheese waited in an untied handkerchief until such time as his thirst should be satisfied. On the other side of the table, the oldest man in Claybury, drawing gently on a long clay pipe, turned a dim and regretful eye up at the old signboard. "I've drunk my beer under it for pretty near 70 years, he said with a sigh. "It's a pity it couldn't have lasted my time." The painter, slowly pushing a wedge of sandwich into his mouth, regarded him indulgently. "It's all through two young gentlemen as was passing through here a month or two ago," continued the old man. "They told Smith, the landlord, they'd been looking all over the place for the cauliflower, and when Miss Smith showed them the sign, they said they thought it was Lord George IV, and a very good likeness too." The painter laughed and took another look at the old sign. Then, with the nervousness of a true artist, he took a look at his own. One or two shadows. He flung his legs over the bench and took up his brushes. In another 10 minutes the most fervent loyalist would have looked in vain for any resemblance, and with a sigh at the pitfalls which beset the artist, he returned to his interrupted meal and hailed the house for more beer. "There's nobody could mistake that sign for anything but a cauliflower," said the old man. "It looks good enough to eat." The painter smiled and pushed his mug across the table. He was a tender-hearted man, and once, when painting the sign of the Sir Wilfrid Lawson, knew himself what it was to lack beer. He began to discourse on art and spoke somewhat disparagingly of the cauliflower as a subject. With a shake of his head, he spoke of the possibilities of a spotted cow or a blue lion. "Talking of lions," said the ancient musingly, "and suppose you never heard tell of the Claybury tiger? Before your time in these parts, I expect." The painter admitted his ignorance, and finding that the allusion had no reference to an inn, pulled out his pipe and prepared to listen. "It's a while ago now," said the old man slowly. "The circus the tiger belonged to was going through Claybury to get to Wickham, when just as they was passing Gill's farm, a steam engine they had to draw some of the vans broke down, and they had to stop while the blacksmith mended it. That being so, they put up the big tent and had the circus right there. I was one of them as went, and I must say it was worth the money, though Henry Walker was disappointed at the man who put his head in the lion's mouth. He said that the man frightened the lion first before he did it. It was a great night for Claybury, and for about a week nothing else was talked of. All the children was playing at being lions and tigers and such like, and young Roberts pretty near broke his back trying to see if he could ride horseback standing up. It was about 2 weeks after when a strange thing happened. The big tiger broke loose. Bill Chambers brought the news first, having read it in the newspaper while he was having his tea. He brought out the paper and showed us, and soon after we heard all sorts of tales of its doings. At first we thought the tiger was a long way off, and we were rather amused at it. Frederick Scott laughed himself silly almost one night, thinking how surprised a man would be if he came home and found the tiger sitting in the armchair eating the baby. It didn't seem much of a laughing matter to me, and I said so. None of us liked it, and even Sam Jones, that has had twins before for a second time, said it was a shame. But Frederick Scott was a man as would laugh at anything. When we heard that the tiger had been seen within 3 miles of Claybury, things began to look serious, and Peter Gubbins said that something ought to be done. But before we could think of anything to do, something did happen. We were sitting here one evening having a mug of beer and a pipe, same as I might be now if I'd got any baccy left, and talking about it. And when we heard a shout and saw a ragged-looking tramp running towards us as fast as he could run, every now and then he'd look over his shoulder and give a shout and then run harder than before. "It's the tiger," says Bill Chambers, and before you could wink, almost he was inside the house, having first upset Smith and a pot of beer in the doorway. Before he could get up, Smith had to wait till we was all in. His language was awful for a man that had his licence to lose, and everybody shouting "Tiger" as they trod on him didn't ease his mind. He was inside almost as soon as the last man, though, and in a flash he had the door bolted as the tramp flung himself against it, all out of breath and sobbing his heart out. "Open the door," he says, banging on it. "Go away," says Smith. "It's the tiger," screams the tramp. "Open the door." "You go away," says Smith. "You're attracting it to my place. Run up the road and draw it off." Just at that moment, John Biggs, the blacksmith, came in from the tap room. As soon as he heard what was the matter, he took down Smith's gun from behind the bar and said he was going out to look out for the women and children. "Open the door," he says. He was trying to get out. The tramp outside was trying to get in, but Smith held on to the door like a Briton. When John Biggs lost his temper and ups and smacked Smith on the head with his gun, Smith fell down at once, and before you could help ourselves, the door was open, the tramp was inside, and John Biggs was running up the road, shouting his hardest. We had the door closed before you could wink almost, and then, while the tramp lay in a corner having brandy, Mrs. Smith got a bowl of water and a sponge and knelt down bathing her husband's head with it. "Did you see the tiger?" says Bill Chambers. "See it," says the tramp with a shiver. "Oh, Lord." He made a sign for more brandy, and Henry Walker, who was acting as landlord without being asked, gave it to him. "He chased me for over a mile," says the tramp. "My heart's breaking." He gave a groan and fainted right off. A terrible faint it was, too. And for some time we thought he'd never come around. First they poured brandy down his throat, then gin, and then beer, and still he didn't come around, but lay quiet, with his eyes closed and an horrible smile on his face. He came round at last, and with nothing stronger than water, which Mrs. Smith kept pouring into his mouth. First thing we noticed was that this smile went, and his eyes opened, and suddenly he sat up with a shiver and gave such a dreadful scream that we thought at first the tiger was on top of us. Then he told us how he was washing his shirt in the ditch when he heard a snuffling noise and saw the head of a big tiger sticking through the hedge on the other side. He left his shirt and ran, and he said that, fortunately, the tiger stopped to tear his shirt to pieces, else his last hour would have arrived. When he'd finished, Smith went upstairs and looked out of the bedroom windows, but couldn't see any sign of the tiger, and he said no doubt it had gone down to the village to see what it could pick up, or perhaps it had eaten John Biggs. However that might be, nobody cared to go outside to see, and after it got dark, we liked going home even less. Up till 10 o'clock we did very well, and then Smith began talking about his licence. He said it was all rubbish being afraid to go home, and at any rate the tiger couldn't eat more than one of us, and while he was doing that there was a chance for the others to get home safe. 2 or 3 of them took a dislike to Smith that night and told him so. The end of it was that we all slept in the tap room that night. It seemed strange at first, but anything was better than going home in the dark, and we all slept till about 4 next morning, when we woke up and found the tramp had gone and left the front door standing wide open. We took a careful look out, and by started going off, and then another, to see whether their wives and children had been eaten or not. Not a soul had been touched, but the women and children was that scared there was no doing anything with them. None of the children would go to school, and they sat at home all day with the front windows blocked up with a mattress to keep the tiger out. Nobody liked going to work, but it had to be done, and as Farmer Gill said, tigers went to sleep all day and only came out towards evening. That comforted a bit. Not a soul went up to the cauliflower that evening for fear of coming home in the dark, but as nothing happened that night, we began to hope as the tiger had travelled further on. Bob Pretty laughed at the whole thing and said he didn't believe there was a tiger, but nobody minded what he said, because Bob Pretty being, as I've often told people, the black sheep of Claybury, what with his poaching and what was worth his artfulness. But for the very next morning something happened that made Bob Pretty look silly, and wish he hadn't talked quite so fast. For at 5 o'clock, Frederick Scott, going down to feed his hens, found as the tiger had been there before him and eaten no less than 7 of them. The side of the hen house was all broken in. There was a few feathers lying on the ground, and 2 little chicks smashed and dead beside them. The way Frederick Scott went on about it, you'd hardly believe. He said the government ought to make it up to him, and instead of going to work, he put the 2 little chicks and the feathers into a pudding basin and walked to Cudford, 4 miles off, where they had a policeman. He saw the policeman, William White by name, standing at the back door of the Fox and Hounds public house, throwing a handful of corn to the landlord's fowls, and the first thing that Mr. Smith said was, "It's off my beat," he says. "But you might do it in your spare time, Mr. White," says Frederick Scott. "It's very likely that the tiger will come back to my hen house for the rest of them, and he'd be very surprised if he popped his head in and saw you waiting for him." "He'll have reason to be," says Policeman White, staring at him. "Well, think of the praise you'd get," said Frederick Scott, coaxing like. "Look here," says Policeman White, "if you don't take yourself and that pudding basin off pretty quick, you'll come along with me, do you see? You've been drinking, and you're in an excited state." He gave Frederick Scott a push and followed him along the road, and every time Frederick stopped to ask what he was doing, he gave him another push to show him. Frederick Scott told us all about it that evening, and some of the bravest of us went up to the Cauliflower to talk over what was to be done, though we took care to get home while it was still light. That night Peter Gubbin's 2 pigs went. They were 2 of the likeliest pigs I ever saw, and all Peter Gubbins could do was to sit up in bed shivering and listening to their squeals as the tiger dragged them off. Pretty near old Claybury was round that sty next morning looking at the broken fence. Some of them looked for the tiger's footprints, but as it was dry weather they couldn't see any. Nobody knew whose turn it would be next, and the most sensible man there, Sam Jones, went straight off home and killed his pig before he went to work. Nobody knew what to do. Farmer Hall said it was all a soldier's job, and he drove over to Wickham to tell the police so. But nothing came of it. And that night at 10 minutes to 12, Bill Chambers' pig went. It was one of the biggest pigs ever raised in Claybury, but the tiger got it off as easy as possible. Bill had the bravery to look out of the window when he heard the pig squeal, but there was so much snarling that he durstn't move hand or foot. Dickie Weed's idea was for people with pigs and such like to keep them in the house of a night, but Peter Gubbins and Bill Chambers both pointed out that the tiger could break a back door with one blow of his paw, and that if he got inside he might take something else instead of a pig. They said that it was no worse for other people to lose pigs than what it was for them. The odd thing about it was that all this time nobody had ever seen the tiger except for the tramp, and people sent their children back to school again and felt safe going about in the day, till little Charlie Gubbins came running home crying and saying he'd seen it. Next morning a lot more children saw it and was afraid to go to school, and people began to wonder what had happened when all the pigs and poultry was gone. Then Henry Walker saw it. We were sitting inside here with scythes and pitchforks and such like handy when we see him come in without his hat. His eyes were staring and his hair was all rumpled. He called for a pot of ale and drank it nearly right off, and then he sat gasping and holding the mud between his legs and shaking his head at the floor till everybody had left off talking to look at him. "What's the matter, Henry?" says one of them. "Don't ask," says Henry with a shiver. "You don't mean to say you've seen the tiger?" Henry Walker didn't answer him. He got up and walked backwards and forwards till, with that frightened look on his eyes, and once or twice he gave such a terrible start that he frightened us half out of our wits. Then Bill Chambers took and forced him into a chair and gave him 2 of gin and patted him on the back, and at last Henry Walker got his senses back again and told us how the tiger had chased him all around the trees in Plashet's Wood until he managed to climb up a tree and escape. He said the tiger had kept him there for over an hour, and then suddenly turned around and bolted off up the road to Wickham. It was a merciful escape, and everyone said so except Sam Jones, and he asked so many questions that at last Henry Walker asked him outright if he disbelieved his words. "It's all right, Sam," says Bob Pretty, as had come in just after Henry Walker. "I see him with the tiger after him." "What?" says Henry, staring at him. "I saw it all, Henry," says Bob Pretty, "and I saw your pluck. It was all you could do to make up your mind to run from it. I believe if you'd had a fork in your hand, you'd have made a fight for it." Everyone said bravo, but Henry Walker didn't seem to like it at all. He sat still, looking at Bob Pretty, and at last he says, "Where was you?" "Up another tree, Henry, where you couldn't see me," says Bob Pretty, smiling at him. Henry Walker, what was drinking some beer, choked a bit, and then he put the mug down and went straight off home without saying a word to anyone. I knew he didn't like Bob Pretty, but I couldn't see why he would be cross about his speaking up for him as he had done, but Bob said it was his modesty and he thought more of him for it. After that things got worse than ever. The women and children stayed indoors and kept the doors shut, and the men never knew when they went out to work whether they'd come home again. They used to kiss their children before they went out of a morning, and their wives too, some of them. Even men who'd been married for years did that. And several more of them saw the tiger while they was at work and came running home to tell about it. The tiger had been making free with Claybury pigs and such like for pretty near a week, and nothing had been done to try and catch it. And what made Claybury men madder than anything else was folks at Wickham saying it was all a mistake and the tiger hadn't escaped at all. Even the parson who'd been away for a holiday said so, and Henry Walker told his wife that if she ever set foot inside that church again, he'd ask his old mother to come and live with him. It was all very well for the parson to talk, but for the very night he came back, Henry Walker's pig went, and at the same time George Kettle lost 5 or 6 ducks. He was a quiet man, was George, but when his temper was up he didn't care for anything. Before he came to Claybury he'd been in the militia, and that evening at the Cauliflower he turned up with a gun over his shoulder and made a speech, and asked who was game to go with him and hunt the tiger. Bill Chambers, who was still grieving after his pig, said he would. Then another man offered, till at last there were 17 of them. Some of them had scythes and some had pitchforks, and 1 or 2 of them had guns, and it was one of the finest sights I ever saw when George Kettle stood them in rows of 4 and marched them off. They went straight up the road and then crossed Farmer Gill's fields to get to Plaship's Wood, where they thought the tiger would most likely be. And the nearer they got to the wood, the slower they walked. The sun had just gone down, and the wood looked very quiet and dark. But John Biggs, the blacksmith, and George Kettle walked in first, and the others followed, keeping so close together that Sam Jones had a few words over his shoulder with Bill Chambers about the way he was carrying his pitchfork. Every now and then somebody would say, "What's that?" and they'd all stop and crowd together and think the time had come, but it hadn't. And then they'd go on again, trembling, until they'd walked all around the wood without seeing anything but 1 or 2 rabbits. John Biggs and George Kettle wanted us to stay there till it was dark, but the others wouldn't hear of it for fear of frightening their wives. And just as it was getting dark, they all came tramp, tramp back to the Cauliflower again. Smith stood 'em 1/2 a pint of beer apiece, and they was all outside fancying themselves a bit for what they'd done when we see old man Parsley coming along on 2 sticks as fast as he could come. "Are you brave lads looking for the tiger?" he asked. "Yes," says John Biggs. "Then hurry up, for the sake of mercy," says old Parsley, putting his hand on the table and going off into a fit of coughing. "It's just gone into Bob Pretty's cottage. I was passing and saw it." George Kettle snatches up his gun and shouts out to his men to come along. Some of them was for hanging back at first, some of them because they didn't like the tiger, and some because they didn't like Bob Pretty. But John Biggs drove them in front of him like a flock of sheep, and then they gave a cheer and ran after George Kettle full pelt up the road. A few women and children was at their doors as they passed, but they took fright and went indoors screaming. There was a lamp in Bob Pretty's front room, but the door was closed and the house was silent as the grave. George Kettle and the men with the guns went first, but then came the pitchforks and last of all the scythes. Just as George Kettle put his hand on the door, he heard something moving inside, and the next moment the door opened and there stood Bob Fitty. "What the dickens?" he asked, starting back as he sees the gun and pitchforks pointing at him. "You killed it, Bob," says George Kettle. "Killed what?" says Bob Fitty. "Be careful of them guns. Take your fingers off the triggers." "The tiger in your house, Bob," says George Kettle in a whisper. "Have you only just come in?" "Look here," says Bob Fitty, "I don't want any of your games. You go and play 'em somewhere else." "It ain't a game," says John Biggs. "The tiger's in your house and we're going to kill it. Now then, lads." They all went in an heap, pushing Bob Fitty in front of them till the room was full. Only one man with the scythe went in, and they wouldn't have let him in if they'd known. It almost made them forget the tiger for a time. George Kettle opened the door what led into the kitchen, and then he sprang back with such a shout that the man with the scythe tried to escape, taking Henry Walker along with him. George Kettle tried to speak but couldn't. All he could do was point his finger at Bob Fitty's kitchen. And Bob Fitty's kitchen was for all the world like a pork butcher's shop. There was joints of pork hanging from the ceiling, 2 tubs of brine as full as they could be, and quite a string of fowls and ducks all ready for market. "What do you mean by coming into my house?" says Bob Fitty, blustering. "If you don't clear out pretty quick, I'll make you." Nobody answered him, but they was all examining hands of pork and fowls and such like. "There's the tiger," says Henry Walker, pointing at Bob Fitty. "That's what old man Parsley meant." "Somebody go and fetch Policeman White," says a voice. "I wish they would," says Bob Fitty. "I'll have the law on you all for breaking into my house, see if I don't." "Where'd you get all this pork from?" says the blacksmith. "And them ducks and hens," says George Kettle. "That's my business," said Bob Fitty, staring them full in the face. "I've had an excellent opportunity offered to me going into the pork and poultry line, and I took it. Now all of them as doesn't want to buy any pork or fowls, get out of my house." "You're a thief, Bob Fitty," says Henry Walker. "You stole it all." "Take care what you're saying, Henry," says Bob Fitty, "or else I'll make you prove your words." "You stole my pig," says Herbert Smith. "Oh, have I?" says Bob, reaching down an hand of pork. "Is that your pig?" he says. "It's just about the size of my poor pig," says Herbert Smith. "It's very usual size, I call it," says Bob Fitty. "And them ducks and hens, very usual looking ducks and hens, I'd call them. Except they don't grow 'em as fat as in these parts. It's a fine thing when a man doing an honest business is to have these charges brought against him. Disheartening, I call it. Don't mind telling you that the tiger got in my back window the other day and took off half a pound of sausages, but you don't hear me complaining and going about calling other people thieves." "Tiger be hanged," says Henry Walker, who was almost certain that a loin of pork on the table was off his pig. "You're the only tiger in these parts." "Why, Henry," says Bob Fitty, "what are you thinking of? Where's your memory? Why, only 2 or 3 days ago you saw it and had to get up a tree out of its way." He smiled and shook his head at him, but Henry Walker only kept opening and shutting his mouth, and at last he went outside without saying a word. "And Sam Jones saw it too," says Bob Fitty. "Didn't you, Sam?" Sam didn't answer him. "And Charlie Hall and Jack Minns and a lot more," says Bob. "Besides, I saw it myself. I can believe my own eyes, I suppose." "We'll have the law on you," says Sam Jones. "As you like," says Bob Fitty, "but I tell you plain, I've got all the bills for this properly made out upstairs, and there's pretty near a dozen of you'll have to go in the box and swear you all saw the tiger. Now, can I sell you any of you a bit of pork before you go? It's delicious eating, and as soon as you taste it you'll know it wasn't grown in Claybury. Or a pair of ducks would have come from 100 miles off and yet look as fresh as if they were only killed last night." George Kettle, whose ducks had gone the night before, went into the front room and walked up and down fighting for his breath. But it was all no good. Nobody ever got the better of Bob Fitty. None of them could swear to their property, And even when it became known a month later that Bob Footy and the tramp knew each other, nothing was done. But nobody ever heard of that tiger any more.